Welcome to Impact Unicorns, the podcast where you meet inspirational entrepreneurs building the next generation of transformative companies. And now, here is your host, Dr. Indranil Ghosh, award-winning author, investor, and advisor to global leaders.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Impact Unicorns. Today I'm delighted to welcome Glen Martin to the show. Glen is an aerospace engineer who spent his early career working on the International Space Station for NASA, satellite networks with Hyox Space and Communications, and aircraft design for the likes of Rolls-Royce, de Havilland Canada, and Douglas Aircraft. As we all know, space research pushes the frontiers of applied science to solve problems that we don't experience in daily life here on Earth. Problems like how to maintain life in a closed environment life support system, how human tissues can be grown in zero gravity to replace organs, and how to build things molecule by molecule in 3D printers using only locally available resources. Thanks to creative entrepreneurs like Glen, technologies derived from space science research often spill over into terrestrial applications which transform the way we live. For example, space research spawned many things we take for granted today, like clean solar power and battery backups for the electrical grid, and the geolocation services that enable Google Maps, Amazon Prime, and Uber. In this podcast, we'll learn how Glen and his tribe of collaborators have used space-age technologies to build 3 successful companies in satellite broadcast, large-scale terrestrial solar power, and intelligent grids. We'll also hear about Glen's new company, Hyox, which is at the forefront of the production and cryogenic storage of hydrogen as a clean fuel for aviation, heavy-duty transportation on the roads, and space itself. Glen, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
An absolute pleasure to be joining you on this podcast.
Excellent. Glen is the founder and chief architect of Hyox Space, and we'll get into that very exciting hydrogen technology company in a moment. But as always in this show, we want to get under the hood of the entrepreneur themselves to begin with. So, Glen, you're a visionary, you're a scientist, you're a 3-time successful entrepreneur going on to your 4th venture. Tell us a bit about your personal journey. Give us a whirlwind tour of all the amazing things that you've done.
Well, I appreciate that, Indranil. So by way of background, born in Canada, raised both in the U.S. and Canada, over 27 different cities. As a kid, my father was working in construction on nuclear power plants, so we moved around quite a bit. Found an early love and passion for aerospace and all things airplane and rocket related, and obviously had a love of science fiction as a kid as well. So when I graduated from high school, I went straight into aerospace engineering school in Toronto at Ryerson University, and found my way shortly thereafter down to California to work on the International Space Station, which for me was a dream come true.
So you're actually a rocket scientist, literally.
That's what my business card said at the time, and I'll take that honor.
Glen, it's interesting that you traveled around a lot in your early years. Probably saw a lot of the world, more than many people can see in a lifetime. Has that played an important role in your life professionally and as an entrepreneur? I mean, you've done so many different businesses that maybe you can go into that, but it seems like there must be a connection between that broad early exposure to the world and all the variety of things that you've done.
Well, that's an interesting observation, Indranil. Yeah, as a child being exposed to numerous different cultures within North America, at the very least, in various large and small cities, up and down towards Florida, California, east and west coasts. I did get a chance as a kid every 6 months basically to hit the reset switch, meet a whole new set of friends, experience a whole new culture and neighborhood and local cuisines. So I think in moving around so much, you do learn to appreciate the subtlest of differences between locations and people and businesses, and you can see where one business might be very successful and apply in an area that perhaps it wasn't, it hadn't been before. So, as in experiencing that as a kid, I think that it was it might have been a good training for me as an entrepreneur to have done that. So that's a very good observation.
I think when you move around a lot, especially young in life, you almost have to do a startup on your life every few years. That's got to have build a skill set that comes in later, useful later.
It certainly does. If you want to look at it that way, yes. I had a new startup, a personal startup every 6 months or so from the time I was 3 years old.
Now, did you ever have a sense early on that you would be an entrepreneur? Was that somehow a dream or a passion or something that you knew you had in you and it was waiting to come out? Or is it something that you grew into and evolved in?
I think more the latter. My vision as a kid was that I was going to be a spaceship designer. I was really passionate about engineering and design, and did whiled away my childhood days at the library and sketching spacecraft and doing blueprints and things like that. It really wasn't until later in my career that I really evolved towards entrepreneurship, simply because I wasn't finding in the traditional aerospace industry satisfaction in doing the kind of work that I really wanted to do, which was really more on the bleeding edge. And so, yeah, by necessity, I think I became an entrepreneur.
I think you worked at Boeing, among the many places that constitute your early experience. Is that correct? And what was it like working at Boeing? And then what was the trigger point that you said, now I'm going to actually go and do my own thing?
Well, actually, early in my career, I worked at two English aerospace companies, Rolls-Royce Aero Engines and de Havilland Canada, which were sort of the Canadian businesses that were established by the two British aerospace giants, and both of which over time, Boeing acquired de Havilland Canada around the time I was working there. Then I went to work for McDonnell Douglas, which was also absorbed by Boeing, and then Hyox Space and Com later in my career, which was purchased by Boeing as well. So effectively, I worked for companies that were acquired by Boeing. And then just around the time that I was at this Hyox Space and Com, I started to look very hard at getting into entrepreneurial ventures. And around that time in the late 90s, I worked with some of the executives at Hyox to spin out a brand new startup company called Protostar, where we purchased distressed satellite assets and launched them over Asia. So that was my first real entrepreneurial venture.
And what drove you to that? What was the trigger point, if you like, that said, I'm done with the corporate world. I'm going to go do my own thing. And part of it is a visionary idea, I imagine, knowing you. But what else was it that it was the right time to go and do that?
Well, like a lot of things in entrepreneurial life, it really was opportunistic. It was an opportunity that was presented to me through some connections that I had made. I left Hyox around the time of the Raytheon acquisition, and Boeing had split it up with Raytheon, and had met through that process, the head of new technology, the CTO, the chair of the board. So I was honored to have been, sort of in the rarest air in the aerospace industry, and we as a small team, found our way through a very visionary entrepreneur at the time that I'd met, Phil Father, who had identified these Hangar Queen satellites that needed, they had, the customer had gone belly up or bankrupt, And so these assets were available for a very low cost. And we decided jointly to go after acquisition of these satellites. And so really it was just down to an opportunity that presented itself at a moment when I was just really at the end of my corporate career.
Now, you went on to do 2 other startups, which don't seem ostensibly to have anything to do with satellites. You went into solar in 2007, Microgrids in 2013, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this is pretty early in the life cycle of both of these industries. So I'm just curious, how did you identify these opportunities? What was your thinking to be getting in, industries, before they were really recognized as, sustainable industries?
Well, aerospace is a very advanced field. Generally speaking, the technologies developed for aerospace are in the most rigorous environment you can imagine. And so, it being in that industry, we were exposed to a lot of the very advanced technologies. As one small example, we were using the internet and email early in the 90s, long before the internet really came on the scene in the .com revolution. And similarly, we were using 3D printing in the early 90s as well, which now has become really more of a much more powerful economic force. So we in working in this industry, we just simply saw a lot. And in doing that, I, as an example, in my entrance into solar, really came through my contacts at McDonnell Douglas's Phantom Works down in Huntington Beach, reaching out to me when they acquired Hughes. There was a solar chip manufacturing component of Hughes called Spectralab, which had the most advanced solar cells on planet Earth, 42% efficiency, which was 3 or 4 times anything commercially available at the time. And through that connection and some other alignments, I got into solar because of that. So really, it just gets down to working in an area where you're exposed to these technologies for very specific aerospace applications, and they're just, before they reach broader adoption in the global economy, we can see the future from the vantage point of aerospace.
That's very interesting. So you have a lens into future technologies ahead of other industries, and I think that's really a driving force here. But you're also hinting at the community that themselves maybe start off in aerospace related, but then diffuse into other industries, and you can go with cohorts of your colleagues and conquer new spaces, if you like.
Exactly. And it's you do need to find the right combination of skills in order to do that. And I'm finding these days, now space, commercial space in particular, is very hot, and there's a whole new host of young engineers that are coming into the area and very entrepreneurially minded, and hundreds of startups across the board, from everything from rockets to satellite companies. So it's just very, what the vision we saw for the future of space at the time, 30 years ago, is really coming to fruition now through a number of different factors and powerful technologies reaching maturation, like artificial intelligence and 3D printing and autonomous robotics.
So let's switch to your latest big venture, big idea, which is Hyox. Because I'm very interested in this project, because not only is it bringing some of that space technology to a new area, which is hydrogen, but of course hydrogen has this huge environmental impact potential to help decarbonize not just the fuels industry, but many other industries. And your company could be at the forefront of that. Tell us how this idea came about, and why, of all the things that you could have done, you focused on this Hyox project.
Well, like the other initiatives that I undertook, it was just a thread that I followed. At the time, I was, we successfully built a very, very large scale solar plant and sold it. At the time, we noted that there was a lot of grid instability that intermittent renewables like solar and wind were creating for the traditional electrical grid. And that's why we got into the smart grid development initiative. And through that, if we're going to be working with a lot of intermittent renewables on the grid, you naturally need a large scale storage. And so we started looking at lithium ion battery as short-term storage, but in order to do long duration, there are only really a handful of mature technologies that could be used for that. One of them was hydrogen. And so we started pulling on that thread, started investigating, started talking to different of the hydrogen players at the time. This was late 2019. And we did note that it was just at the moment of inflection. I mean, the companies that we were talking to in 2019 were just maturing. They were maybe 10 years old. Nel Hydrogen, Siemens Energy, some of the other electrolyzer companies were coming along very rapidly. And then obviously the large movement at the political and global level socially for decarbonization of the entire economy was reaching its peak. And with the Paris Accords and the carbon greenhouse gas reduction commitments that were being made by national governments globally, the mandates were coming down that not only generation of electricity had to be decarbonized, but the entire economy, which includes heavy industry, transportation, and heat, which is a very large contributor to greenhouse gases. So it was a combination of the technologies becoming mature and the mandates coming down for greenhouse gas reduction. And by combining the two, green hydrogen really is the solution for these harder to abate sectors of the economy.
That's right, of course. And, the green hydrogen process is, of course, electrolyzing water to generate that hydrogen in a clean way, assuming, of course, the electricity comes from a clean source, some form of renewable. So because, about 70% plus of the cost of that green hydrogen production is related to the cost of energy, there's a lot of competition around just scale, building bigger plants so you can get economies of scale on the electrolyzers and the site and everything, but also finding the lowest cost of electricity. So is that all there is to it? Is it just a brute force approach, or what else is Hyox doing to go beyond that?
Well, that's very true. We at Hyox, we took a look at the capital costs of water electrolysis. As you mentioned, it's 72% right now of the cost stack, as is the cost of electricity, roughly. And there are two other factors that really do drive, the output costs of hydrogen. For green hydrogen, right now, it's still more expensive than the gray hydrogen, the dirty hydrogen that is produced using methane. And so with Hyox, what we're doing is looking at every factor, every stage of electrolysis through liquefaction, compression, storage, and distribution. And we've noted that there is an opportunity to further reduce the costs by applying very advanced technologies to that entire system of hydrogen production. And what we've done is assembled a blue chip team of researchers out of the space industry. We've got a group out of MIT JPL that worked on the MOXIE electrolyzer that flew to Mars on Perseverance rover. We're pulling together a team of folks that, once again, from aerospace, that worked on everything from the shuttle program to the Delta IV rocket, which is a hydrogen-fueled rocket, as well as going back as far as the NASA's X-33 program, which had a very challenging composite cryogenic propulsion system. So we feel at Hyox that we can actually bend the cost curve down further than would be experienced over the next 10 years by simple brute force economies of scale and incremental improvements in overall technology on efficiency and production output.
Yeah, and I think it's more than just cost as well, because the part of the value chain that you're focusing on, which is to liquefy, the hydrogen, suddenly makes it much more easily transportable. And if anything, the biggest bottleneck in this whole hydrogen economy seems to be not producing the hydrogen, because if you produce it close to where there's big demand, like a chemical cluster or a transportation hub, that already goes a long way. But if you can actually also move it economically to everywhere else that needs the hydrogen, you've basically unlocked the decarbonization of all the industry. And I think from an impact standpoint, what's so exciting about what you're doing.
Well, that's truly an insight, Indranil. That's exactly the balancing act we're going into here, which is you can co-locate next to a hydroelectric plant far in the north of Canada, or large-scale solar down in Saudi Arabia, as an example, and then ship via liquid, or say ammonia also is another energy carrier that we could use. But you're right, getting to liquid for long distance shipping is critical path. And we're working with various distribution partners in finding ways to distribute using multimodal shipping networks through containerization. So once we get the hydrogen gas into liquid form, we can then put it into these containers and ship on trucks, rail, maritime, whatever modality exists. And so what we've been doing is focusing on deploying hydrogen production facilities at the multimodal nodes. And that is the balancing act between on-site and being co-located with the green hydrogen or green electron sources, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and so there's that business, but then with the advanced cryogenics team that you've assembled, you'll be able to go beyond and take that hydrogen in a low-cost way to wherever it needs to go. And I think that will be transformational.
That is our belief, Indranil, and we are focused on getting to market in the 2024-2025 timeframe, at which point there will be a massive adoption of hydrogen. In looking at all of the numbers across the board, there are a number of areas that are simply going to have to go to hydrogen, particularly heavy-duty transport and aviation. And in so doing, finding ways to economically produce hydrogen, green hydrogen, at the nodes, the multimodal nodes, is going to be critical in order to decarbonize these sectors.
Now, in any business, but particularly in a startup or a venture, execution is everything. So let's look forward a year from now. What would you like to be able to say that you did in these next 12 months?
Well, going back to my childhood desire to be a designer of spaceships, what in 1 year's time, what we as a company, Hyox Space, is going to be focusing on is development of the detailed technical design of the xenomorph hydrogen production facility. And it's going to be 3D printed using AI optimization for the topology of the design. And it'll include some autonomous robotics as well. So we should have a fully realized vision of the design and have some prototypes built and being tested in 1 year's time.
Fantastic. That's going to be exciting. And you're also doing some development work with transportation companies, from what I understand, to actually also start producing and supplying these hubs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're working with 3 different partners. I cannot mention names at this point, but I'll give you a broad description of what they're doing. One, and really the leading one that we're working with now, is working in the aviation vertical. They are creating hydrogen technologies for fueling of turboprop aircraft, large turboprop aircraft. So they've come up with a very clever and advanced system that will really revolutionize the way that hydrogen is utilized in the aviation sector. And so in working with them closely, we believe that we can make a very large impact much sooner in converting the aviation aircraft to hydrogen, both fuel cell and then direct burn into turbojet engines, turbofans these days. But that's moving very rapidly, and again, in partnership with them. And we're also working with two other companies, one in the trucking, heavy-duty trucking area that's revolutionizing hydrogen long-haul trucking, as well as another partner in space, actually, in propellant manufacturing, using hydrogen for the creation of green methane, which is to say zero carbon rocket fuel.
Well, there's a lot on your plate, but if anyone can do it, I'm sure you can, Glen. So thank you for joining us. I'm sure you're well on the way to becoming an impact unicorn, and we look forward to checking in on you from time to time as you progress.
Indranil, it's been my absolute pleasure. So thank you so much for having me on your show.
Thanks, Glen. Take care.
You too.